Hello, and welcome to Money Talks, a special extra podcast from Slate Money where we chat with brilliant and interesting people. I'm Emily Peck. I'm a correspondent at Axios and a co-host of Slate Money, and I'm so excited to be here with Simone Foxman. She's a longtime finance reporter at Bloomberg News who has been closely following something of great interest to me and a lot of other people, and that's the backlash against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs inside companies. Simone, welcome to Money Talks.
Hi, Emily. So glad to be with you.
Yay. So you covered hedge funds for a really long time, but now you're diving into, I guess, the intersection of social issues with business and finance, which is a rich topic these days. And that's what I really want to dive into. Now that we know Donald Trump is returning to the White House, we know he took action against DEI at the later stages of his first administration. And I think companies now are really bracing for another wave of backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion if they haven't already scaled things back. So I really want to talk about what the backlash has looked like over the past few years, what Donald Trump's return to the White House is going to mean for DEI. And I guess I have a bigger picture question of, do these efforts, have they actually been very effective? There's a lot of people upset about this backlash, but I want to pull back and say, what has it all meant? So yeah, I want to get into all of this, how it unfolded, how it started, and that's all coming up on Slate Money Talks. Apple Card is the perfect card for your holiday shopping. When you use Apple Card on your iPhone, you'll earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, including products at Apple like a new iPhone 16 or Apple Watch Ultra. Apply now in the Wallet app on your iPhone. Subject to credit approval. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Terms and more at applecard.com. So, Simone, you wanted to get into how this all started?
Yeah, let's take us back to, frankly, like the 1960s. There were efforts to try and diversify the workforce. Before then, there would be signs saying you can't apply if you are a certain race or if you're a certain gender. And really, for a long time, these efforts have existed to try and slowly diversify the workforce. I think that things have changed gradually over time, but especially in the last decade or so. Remember the moment of Me Too, real efforts to try and see women in the workplace and more women in higher management roles. And then, of course, I think everything really gained a lot of steam with the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Billions of dollars in pledges from companies, not only to bring people up within their organizations, but also to try and incorporate them more into the broader business flow, to tap diverse suppliers, minority-owned and women-owned businesses, diversity bonuses for meeting aspirational goals about how many people of color or women you see at different levels of the business. And really, where this backlash began was almost immediate, I think. It's become this, well, first we saw it, I guess, with critical race theory and this idea that there's, these broad systemic historical injustices towards especially Black people in this country, the descendants of slaves. And then more recently, this has evolved into this backlash against DEI specifically. And there's been a variety of ways that this has manifested, both through conservative activists as well as sort of government officials, especially at the state level.
Before we sort of get to those efforts, I wanted to there was diversity, equity, and inclusion pre-George Floyd and post-George Floyd. Before George Floyd, what did those company efforts really look like, and how effective were they?
I would say that the difference pre and post is not so much the substance of actually what was happening, as it was the interest by corporate executives, especially the C-suite, in magnifying and projecting those efforts. And of course, you had more people adopting them. So for a long time, there have been things like diversity trainings to try and apprise people of potential biases that they may have. Some of these things look like mentoring programs, especially targeted at women and people of color or other disadvantaged groups, LGBTQ people in the workplace, people with disabilities, veterans. Then there are, things like diversity bonuses, which include, meeting a certain number of people who are of different race or of different gender or what have you at different levels of the company. And there's been a lot of discussion for a long time about how successful these things actually are. As far back as 2007, there were two researchers, Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev, who really talked about how mandatory diversity trainings were not particularly successful. The threats of incurring legal action if you discriminated, not particularly successful as well, but they found other things that were a little bit more so.
Like what?
Diversity councils, diversity officers, identifying specific problems within your employee chain and employee advancement chain. Mentoring programs, very successful. That's one that constantly comes up. Recruiting, especially looking to HBCUs, has been successful over time. And a certain amount of voluntary diversity trainings. Still some question marks about that. But, if people want to learn more about other groups of people, we've seen some positive impact of that. The question marks are really, we have to take a course online and sit there and click some buttons. That's not necessarily the most successful way of encouraging diversity firm-wide.
I really noticed during the Obama years that corporate DEI efforts ramped up and became more companies were sort of publicizing what they were doing and wanting to talk about it, putting out reports. During Gamergate, if you remember that, in the 2015s and 16s. Yeah, there was a lot more talk about women in tech and tech firms like, Facebook under Sheryl Sandberg and Google. They were really kind of at the forefront of a lot of this, especially I remember anti-bias training, and Google was, a real champion of that, and efforts to bring more women into tech. Sandberg at Facebook was really into that. Those seem like just really long gone days. But you can see the connection there between who's in the Oval Office and what their priorities are and how that kind of trickles down to corporate America, which is now a totally different conversation with Trump headed back to the White House. So in 2020, Trump was in the White House, and companies post George Floyd started really leaning into DEI, publicizing their efforts. Talk about, you said the backlash started immediately, but I sort of feel like the backlash really intensified when the Supreme Court gutted affirmative action. What year was that? That was 2023, June, I think. And that was the fair admissions case. They said, you couldn't have affirmative action at the university level. And everyone at the time was like, oh no, this means we can't have diversity, equity, inclusion in companies. Do I sort of have that right?
Yeah, though, when I say it started almost immediately, I think you have to look at September 2020. And this was when there were a lot of backlash against CRT, critical race theory. You may recall, or may not, because it never really went into effect, that Donald Trump put forth an executive order banning certain bias trainings. Essentially, bias trainings that he said made people feel guilty, really restricted initiatives overall. It just never really went into effect. But what has happened over those intervening years was, DEI flourished to some degree under the Biden administration. And then, as you say, there was this affirmative action decision. And while that really focused on universities and academia, I think corporate executives saw the writing on the wall, and they all went back to their own programs and said, is what I am doing, does that in any way stand to violate some of the same principles that the Supreme Court brought to universities? And so they all kind of reassessed their various programs. And then shortly thereafter, within a month or two, we saw conservative activists, the likes of Edward Blum in specific, coming out and actually suing companies over programs that he believed unfairly discriminated against white people or men. So you saw law firms, especially Perkins Coie, for example, facing lawsuits about various fellowships and internship programs that they had that were only targeted at specific traditionally marginalized groups. And they essentially did away with them. And he settled. He didn't want money. He wanted to send a message. And it was a series of law firms. That message was quickly sent. Everyone kind of either opened those programs up generally or just got rid of them wholesale.
It's pretty incredible. So Edward Blum is the guy behind the affirmative action lawsuit. And to me, it's pretty incredible how fast law firms and companies rolled over on their minority fellowships after that suit was filed. I mean, it didn't go to trial. It was just sort of starting to bubble up. And these fellowships, let's see if I have this right. The fellowships were basically law students who were minorities got fellowships. They were the ones considered for the roles. So so as soon as those programs were questioned, law firms, companies were like, okay, forget it. Like, it's just instant pullback. Did that surprise you?
No. And I will say this. You have to remember with affirmative action, 68% of Americans, according to a Gallup poll, said ending affirmative action was mostly a good thing. And that included 2% of Black adults, 68% of Hispanic adults. So I think more broadly, there is this reaction to, if you are a certain group and receiving perhaps a benefit, you're maybe getting hired, you're maybe allowed into a position you wouldn't necessarily be allowed into. And this is, again, a complicated subject. That idea is something that a broad swath of Americans kind of reject. Now, that's not to say that any of the people that won these fellowships or won these internships would not have received them anyway. It's not to say that this didn't just encourage recruitment efforts, but it didn't surprise me because I think there's this broader movement of the American public's views on affirmative action or anything that looks like it kind of shifting overall. I will say that this was a targeted effort, however. Going after the corporate law firms that advise Fortune 500 companies sends a message. And there was no surprise to see it swiftly trickle down. Now, I will say also, these internships and these fellowships that are targeted at traditionally marginalized groups, including in some cases first-generation college students of any race, have not entirely gone away. They've just opened up to allow more people. Anyone can apply. And, it's a good question to ask whether that's a bad thing. That is something that corporate America is kind of still sorting out.
Okay, so let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to talk to you about the other people going after companies on DEI, because there are some new actors that have been really effective. So we'll be right back with that. Apple Card is the perfect card for your holiday shopping. When you use Apple Card on your iPhone, you'll earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, including products at Apple like a new iPhone 16 or Apple Watch Ultra. Apply now in the Wallet app on your iPhone. Subject to credit approval. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Terms and more at applecard.com. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
This episode is brought to you by Global X. Since 2008, Global X ETFs has been committed to empowering investors with unexplored, intelligent solutions. Global X specializes in exchange-traded funds that offer exposure to the artificial intelligence ecosystem, including themes like data centers, robotics, semiconductors, and cloud computing. To learn more about Global X's entire suite of ETFs, from covered calls, fixed income, emerging markets, and more, visit globalxetfs.com.
Connect to the world with special Turkish Airlines fares. Book your flight before November 30th and take advantage of great deals. Fly to the most exciting destinations with the award-winning airline that flies to more countries than any other. Terms and conditions apply. For more details, visit TurkishAirlines.com. Turkish Airlines. Widen your world.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at Opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
Okay, so you mentioned Edward Blum's lawsuits, but then there's Stephen Miller, who is about to head back to the Trump White House. He has his own group. Can you talk about what he's been up to?
Yeah, America First Legal has been targeting various companies, and most of those are not lawsuits. There's certain administrative regulatory complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. It sort of varies from a company to company basis, but essentially he's doing a similar thing. Edward Blum's idea, and critics take issue with this idea, is there should be no discrimination anywhere. Your race should not come up at all in any hiring or admissions or anything like that. Stephen Miller has more embraced this idea that some of these DEI efforts are actually discrimination against white men or Asian people, for example, and kind of push this as more of a culture war, I suppose, thing. I mean, obviously, he's very involved in politics. America First Legal does other stuff. So he's a bit more of the political end of the anti-DEI program.
His America First Legal has sued, 25 different companies?
Oh boy, I'm actually not sure, but it's been quite a few. And note that he's involved in other issues, immigration-related issues, for one example, but plenty of other things.
I think one of your pieces in Bloomberg, and this was a while ago, said at least 25, so I imagine it's probably more by now. Do you think DEI and attacks on DEI will be a focus of Miller's as he heads back to the White House? Or what does it say that this guy is going back? He's, I'd say, one of the leading DEI backlash activists. What does it mean that it goes back to the Trump administration? It's just another sign of where they're at, I guess.
I don't think the Trump administration has been shy about its desire to dismantle DEI, frankly. And they see it as part of this kind of anti-woke agenda that they want to pursue. I think absolutely it says something that Stephen Miller is going back, or maybe going back to the White House. It also says something, frankly, there's a lot of conservative activists that have been very influential, that have to some degree been associated with Trump's campaign. I think that's the message, that's the writing on the wall. And you have various advocates of DEI essentially preparing to fight this.
Are they preparing to fight it? What are they actually doing? Because most of the people I've spoken with, DEI consultants, say things like, well, we won't use DEI as a term anymore. We're going to explain more what we want to do. We'll focus on casting a wide net in recruiting. But it seems to me that retreat mode is the mode. It doesn't seem to me like there's a big capital R DEI resistance. It was such a corporate thing always to begin with. It's hard to imagine much of a fight happening.
I guess it's a good question whether or not it's actually a fight. What I see is, yes, there's a retreat. And we wrote, for example, about Wall Street retreating from DEI, opening its fellowships and internship programs up to multiple people. But I think there's also a way of looking at this as pulling back to the walls, the moat one can defend legally. And that at that point, you may see certain activists try and come after some of those policies. But actually, this is what companies think they can defend. So, for example, limiting these internship opportunities that were at one point just for specific groups, opening that up to everyone allows you to defend those programs as this is good for everyone. We are especially trying to increase the presence of minority groups with this, but anyone can apply. So if you are a white guy who's done a ton of work in inner city schools and really, made some certain strides there, maybe you could qualify for this. Is that DEI by any other name? Does the word DEI, continue to exist? I don't know. But it's not like these companies, especially the companies most recently who've announced that they're stepping back, they're curtailing their DEI. It's not like they're limiting, that we've seen at least, it's not like they're cutting benefits for transgender people to gender-affirming care. It's not like they're completely stopping. They're just not talking about this stuff anymore. They're providing a defensible barrier to try and continue to retain employees, but also not face public backlash or lawsuits.
Right. That's what I've also heard, companies continue to try and be a welcoming place for women and people of color and LGBTQ plus employees, especially right now when there is just immense backlash, especially against trans people, companies can still, provide health insurance coverage for people and try to be an inclusive place for all employees without having to send out press releases about it as they maybe would have in 2020.
There's definitely a business case for that because you want to retain individuals. You want to retain talent. You don't want your LGBTQ employees saying, well, I don't want to work here anymore because this doesn't seem like a welcoming place. It's clear where the young people are headed. There's, more openness towards LGBTQ issues. Certainly the workforce is way more diverse than it used to be. So the companies are kind of in this balancing act of how visible do I want to be, but how much do I need to keep in order to retain my youngest, newest employees?
Right. Yeah. Someone said to me, the demographics are undeniable, especially with women. I mean, more women graduate from college now. More workers in the educated workforce are women. There's more people of color. We're just a more diverse country, and it's only going to get more diverse. And it would be impossible for companies to just try and hold that back, I guess. Anyway, I want to talk about two other things before we finish this out. Let's start with Paul Singer, because I did not realize how involved he was in anti-DEI efforts. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so he's the chairman of the Manhattan Institute. And this is a think tank, kind of an old, sleepy think tank that he's really invigorated since he became chairman, about 15 years ago. And one of the things they have really targeted is diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in schools and universities. And frankly, the idea there is that Republicans didn't have control of the White House. They didn't have control of all the levers of Congress. And so there was a limit to how much you could restrict DEI. Critical race theory has been it's something their scholars write a lot about. But by authoring model legislation and then going and essentially presenting it. I would say selling it, but presenting it very carefully. They're not lobbyists. This is a 501c3 organizations. To states across the country, they've had a lot of conservative lawmakers introduce bills to limit DEI. And they say that their ideas have been used in 11 states as of June, codified into law in various ways to eliminate DEI programs. I think we can expect to see some of the same ideas that have been promoted by the Manhattan Institute, certainly by Paul Singer himself, in legislation or rulemaking at the federal level come January.
How much money is Paul Singer spending on this, on the Manhattan Institute and these efforts? It's not insubstantial.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to tell exactly how much he's spending on each specific effort, but one of their biggest policy organizations within the Institute is essentially towards these sorts of things, dismantling DEI, changing the way people talk about race. And a lot of this is under the aegis of Christopher Rufo, another conservative activist, real proponent of trying to rebuild the right. He is an employee there and is in charge of these efforts. Overall, Singer has raised some $200 million, I believe, in the past, 10 years in order to further these efforts. This has really become a place where they are the voice of this. But they're also a kind of different voice than the Heritage Foundation, the Project 2025 folks. This is a very Wall Street voice. They have lots of Wall Street supporters that are putting money into these efforts. And it will be interesting to see exactly what succeeds, at least on the DEI front. This seems to be a place where there's broad agreement among conservatives, but we'll see how it plays out for sure.
That's really been new because for so long, Wall Street seemed to be begrudgingly just doing a lot of this stuff. Banks were making statements about it. At least the window dressing was, we want more women to rise to the top. There's prominent activist groups that promote LGBTQ people on Wall Street. And to read about Paul Singer consolidating and promoting what really seems like serious backlash to decades of efforts is not great news, I think, for people who care about that stuff.
There's a divide between asset management, hedge funds, private equity, real estate, and the banks. And the banks have become very state. I think they see some of their DEI efforts as some of the best things they've done since the financial crisis to rehabilitate their image. They want to extend credit to traditionally marginalized groups. They want to waive fees for ATMs for, minority-owned credit unions and things like that. And then you have the asset managers who think a little bit differently. I will say that the protests on Ivy League and other university campuses in the wake of October 7th and the attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians, and then the ensuing conflict between Israel and Gaza has really changed the game. I think Bill Ackman is a great epitome of this to a degree. These are hedge fund managers in the large part, private equity managers, often going out and blaming DEI for causing this university backlash, for, blaming them for, frankly, supporting Hamas. I think the DEI conversation has blown out of control in the wake of October 7th with, hedge fund managers fingering that for this is what the problem is. We've seen that play out. I will say, though, I don't think that all of hedge fund land is particularly anti-diversity. And this is my biggest, one of the issues I really want to explore deeply in the coming year. There are a lot of people who believe that diversity is good. It's good for business. And they just disagree about how to get there. Like, why are mentorship programs bad? If that's your effort at DEI, and frankly, anyone can sign up for this mentorship program, how is that a bad thing? And I think there are a lot of people on the center right who would agree with that. They just don't see that as that's the DEI program.
The biggest piece of the backlash seems to be against having like hiring targets or quotas or talking about that kind of thing, like specifically aiming to hire more women or Black people or Hispanic people. That's what really upsets critics. Although they levy these ad hominem attacks that are, they're kind of insane, Simone.
They will. Yeah. And I will also say that on the pro DEI side, you attack anything DEI. There was a HR organization that said it was getting rid of the E in program, and HR executives flipped out. They were attacking each other online. This was this huge battle. And, the message there by President Johnny Taylor was people just don't understand what equity means. And so, therefore, we can keep these programs around better because it's still important to us, but we'll be able to send a clearer message. So on the left, I guess, you see this, enormous, visceral, vehement reaction every time anyone attacks anything DEI. And it makes for a very extremist conversation on both sides. There's not a lot of people coming together on this. It's all or nothing.
I'm going to push back a little on that because I've been talking to some consultants lately. And since Trump's election especially, I'm hearing like, we need to do a better job communicating. Maybe we're not going to use the term anymore. We need to pull back on hiring targets and things like that. Like it does seem like there is an effort and a reckoning happening. And I would like to add that Johnny Taylor, who led the organization that took the E out of the DEI, has been rumored to be up for consideration for a role in the Trump administration. Have you seen that?
Oh, no,
I feel like these two things are related somehow.
So you're speaking to consultants who often work with C-suite executives who say we still want our DEI programs, but we know we have to change. I would say that you also see on the left from folks like the Human Rights Campaign, just painting the election as an attack on diversity overall. This is the largest and most influential organization that really advocates for LGBTQ people. And they've had especially a lot of influence in the workforce, but they've seen a lot of companies pull back. And I think the reason that companies pull back, and we've spoken with, executives, is they don't want to appear like they are partisan. They don't want to appear like they're backing things that many of their more conservative employees don't want. And so the idea of Johnny Taylor, accurate or no, going to the Trump administration is maybe he is saying, well, I want to have more influence and I can work with whoever. Maybe he has very conservative views, who knows? But I think there's a desire by some groups to reorient themselves to say, I still want to have an influence, even if the administration is talking about getting rid of DEI wholesale. I think that I can convince them that we need diversity of some sort.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Robbie Starbuck, who has become, I mean, we had Christopher Rufo in 2020 leading the charge against critical race theory. And I feel like now Robbie Starbuck is the one sort of leading the charge against DEI with success. He's gotten a few companies to pull back on their efforts, yes?
So Robbie Starbuck, by my last count, was associated with announcements by 9 companies to pull back on DEI. Now, some of those companies said, well, we were already kind of doing these things before, but many of them had been contacted by him at least in advance of announcing that they were curtailing their DEI programs. One of the main ways they curtailed that was by eliminating contributions to the Human Rights Campaign, for one, but other things as well. But yes, he is a conservative influencer who essentially, more than any of the other activists, has just gone out online and ginned up a lot of anger against companies with DEI programs. And he'll kind of pull out some of the most controversial ones. He'll pull out, especially having to do with the LGBTQ community, and he'll try and get people angry at them online and then threaten a boycott. And so this has worked at, Tractor Supply. It's worked at Deere & Co., Ford, Lowe's, Brown-Forman. All these major U.S. companies really announced that they were pulling back on their DEI programs. And I think this is only testament to the public backlash.
We're speaking around the same time that Congress is trying to pass this resolution not allowing a new member, Sarah McBride, to use the bathroom of her choice. This is a clear, to me, DEI kind of battle. I do think it's one that you could see in corporate America. And I wonder about, beyond like what will the new Trump administration do around DEI, or will the new Congress do around DEI? Something like this, a fight like this over, whether or not incoming lawmaker can use whatever bathroom she wants, is just setting tone at the top, as they say, and how that trickles out to companies, I think, is something to watch. Is that something you're thinking about?
Absolutely. Because while executives, even of the companies that I mentioned, will say, oh, well, no, we're still committed to diversity. We're still committed to making sure our workforce, LGBTQ workforce especially, feels supported. If you are at the top saying, we could see federal contractors, for example, maybe have to adopt a similar policy. If, leadership is saying that's okay, what kind of message does that send to people at the very bottom? Absolutely. I mean, from government to elsewhere, women in the military, Pete Hegseth, the current pick to lead the Pentagon, has also talked about not wanting women in combat roles and questioning their role in the military. I think there are a lot of signals that you can send from the top that certainly are going to make people angry, but also send a message of you're not wanted here.
Yeah, that seems like it's just something, I guess, to watch and to watch out for. And even if companies aren't making statements or sending out press releases about their diversity efforts, it's something that internally they can be reassuring to workers about things like this and say, we want to be a welcoming place. That seems to be something really important that should be happening right now. I don't know if it is yet.
I think also there are many DEI advocates, and especially this is a message you get from, there's a handful of DEI scholars at NYU, Kenji Ashino and David Glasgow. One of the things that they have said is, regardless of which side you're on, if you're Edward Bloom or otherwise, you should acknowledge that discrimination is discrimination is discrimination. So if Black people are being discriminated against or white guys are being discriminated against, if you truly believe that there should be no preference for anybody, then you have to see it on all sides. And I do wonder what kind of legal battles we will see if we do see a rolling back of DEI. Certainly advocates like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center too, have said, if you start discriminating against the people that you were just trying to help, we're going to sue you. And I think we could see that very broadly.
So before we go, I want to ask you what to look for from Trump 2.0. What kind of actions is he going to take around DEI? Would we expect him to put back in place those executive orders you already talked about? What other things would we expect?
Yeah, absolutely. He'll put back into place that executive order and likely repeal one that the Biden team had actually put forth on their first day to try and unrestrict DEI trainings. Certainly, we expect to see scrutiny of various diversity programs by the Department of Labor. We'd already seen that last term with Microsoft, Wells Fargo. Maybe more successes by conservative activists. Within Project 2025, for example, they advocate deleting terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, also gender equality, gender identity from every federal rule, agency regulation, contract grant regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. That is a quote. Maybe around women too, pregnancy especially. The Biden administration has tried to say you can't discriminate based on pregnancy in a way that went beyond previous law, and so we'll see if we see that again. And then federal contracting, anything where a company works for the government. It really restricts what kind of policies they can pursue. They have to that was the whole point of all this equal opportunity stuff back in, the JFK era was will affect the way federal contractors do business. We could see the Trump administration essentially use it in a very different fashion.
And this is no small workforce. I mean, unless Elon Musk has his way and fires everyone who works for the federal government, we're talking about, I think, the largest workforce in the United States that is about to see DEI sort of come under attack. And we can see, firsthand what that means in terms of who works for the federal government and what those workplaces look like.
Yeah, and frankly, it's just not the government itself. Federal contractors are Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all the defense contractors, food companies, you name it. Now, if they sell to the federal government, they might be affected by this. And that is an enormous workforce, even if Doge and Elon Musk get rid of a lot of actual federal employees.
Anything else you want to add, Simone, before we go?
There's a lot to focus on here. And I would emphasize, the debates around DEI. They're not just DEI specifically. They're not just specific programs. They're really about diversity of the American workforce and American opportunity. And there is an opportunity to call DEI or do DEI differently. And there are lots of critics of it. And we'll see where this goes. I think there was a feeling in the Obama administration that we were moving past race, especially. I think, if anything, we've focused a lot more on it in recent years. And so we'll see what comes of this next 4 years.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And that's our show for the week. Thanks to Jessamine, Molli, and Cheyna Roth for producing. Ben Richmond is Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio for Slate. And I'll be back in your feed on Saturday for a regular episode of Slate Money. And until then, thanks for listening.